Carl Jung said that everything that is not made conscious appears in our life as fate. Welcome to the shadow of marriage. There is a question that most people never ask out loud, even though they have been living inside it for years. It surfaces in the quiet moments, in the car alone, in the space between sleep and waking, in the middle of an argument that feels disturbingly familiar. The question is this: why does this keep happening to me? Not in a self-pitying way, not as a complaint, as a genuine, bewildered, increasingly urgent inquiry. Why do I keep ending up here? Different name, different face, different set of circumstances, the same feeling, the same dynamic, the same particular quality of pain that I have been trying to leave behind since the last time, and the time before that, and the time before that. In my clinical practice, I have sat across from this question more times than I can count. It arrives wearing different faces. The woman on her third marriage who cannot understand why she keeps choosing men who eventually withdraw from her in the same way her father did when she was 9 years old. The woman who has left and returned to the same relationship 5 times, each time convinced that this time will be different, each time discovering that the fundamental dynamic between them has not changed at all. The woman who ended one relationship specifically to avoid a particular pattern and then, 18 months later, found herself in an entirely new relationship with an entirely different person, and recognized, with a horror that felt almost supernatural, that the pattern had followed her. Same script, different actor. This is not bad luck. It is not a cosmic punishment or a character flaw or evidence that you are somehow broken beyond repair. It is something far more specific and far more understandable than any of those things. It is the unconscious doing precisely what Jung spent his life describing, running its programs below the threshold of awareness, shaping your choices and your attractions and your interpretations of other people's behavior from a place where you cannot examine it or challenge it or choose differently, until you can. Jung said it with the precision that made his work so enduring. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Not metaphorically, literally. The patterns that feel like destiny, the ones that seem to follow you across relationships, across years, across the distance you have tried to put between yourself and the version of your life you wanted to leave behind, are not destiny. They are psychology, and psychology, unlike fate, can be understood. And what can be understood can be changed. This video is about that change. Not the surface level change of different behaviors or different choices made by the same unconscious self, but the deeper change, the change that Jung called individuation, of becoming conscious enough of your own inner landscape that your attractions, your patterns, your repeated choices begin to be shaped by awareness rather than by the unexamined wounds that have been running them since long before you were old enough to know they were there. If you are watching this and something in that description feels uncomfortably familiar, if the question of why this keeps happening has been following you for longer than you would like to admit, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel now and turn on notifications, because what we explore here is not relationship advice in the conventional sense. It is the psychological work that makes real change in relationships possible. Every video in this series goes somewhere deeper than the last. Let me tell you about a woman I will call Isabel. Isabel was 43 years old when she came to see me. She had been married twice. The first marriage, to a man named David, had ended after 7 years when she finally accepted that his emotional unavailability was not a temporary state she could love him out of, but a permanent feature of who he was and how he had decided to be in relationship. The second marriage, to a man named Thomas, had ended after 4 years, for reasons that Isabel described to me in our first session with a quality of incredulity that I recognized immediately. The incredulity of a woman who cannot believe she is telling this story again. Thomas was different from David in almost every measurable way. Different background, different profession, different temperament, different way of moving through the world, and yet the experience of being married to him had produced with an almost eerie consistency the same essential feeling that being married to David had produced, the feeling of reaching for someone who was always, just slightly, somewhere else, the feeling of being in a relationship with a man who was present in body and absent in the way that actually mattered, the feeling of being, in the most intimate context of her life, fundamentally alone. When Isabel finished describing both marriages to me, she sat back in her chair and said something that I have heard in various forms from many women who have arrived at this particular moment of recognition. She said, "I feel like I am haunted, like there is something that follows me. And I don't understand what it is or where it comes from or how to make it stop. What haunts us is almost never what we think it is." In clinical work with women who repeat relational patterns, the haunting almost never turns out to be a type of man or a category of relationship or a failure of judgment in partner selection. The haunting is always, without exception, something internal, something that was formed early, that was formed in response to an environment that the child had no choice but to adapt to, and that has been operating in the background of every significant relationship since, shaping what feels familiar, what feels like chemistry, what feels like the particular magnetic pull that we call attraction. Jung's concept of the shadow is essential here. The shadow is not simply the dark side of the personality in the simplistic sense that popular culture tends to use the term. The shadow is everything that has been excluded from the conscious self, the parts of our experience, our desires, our fears, our wounds that were deemed unacceptable or unsafe to acknowledge, and that were therefore pushed below the threshold of awareness. And one of the shadow's most powerful and most consistent expressions is in the patterns of romantic attraction, because the shadow does not disappear simply because we refuse to look at it. It goes underground and operates from there. And in the territory of intimate relationship, which is, by its nature, the territory where we are most exposed, most vulnerable, most visible, the shadow's influence is strongest. Here is what this looks like in practice, and I want to be precise because the clinical reality of shadow projection in relationships is more specific and more actionable than the general description of it tends to suggest. When we are consistently attracted to a particular type of person, when there is a recognizable quality, an energy, a dynamic that seems to pull us towards certain people and certain kinds of relationships again and again, that attraction is almost always a form of projection. We are not simply responding to something that is in the other person. We are responding to something that is in us, something that we have not yet been able to integrate consciously, something that the other person carries in a form that activates it. For Isabel, that something was a wound that had been formed before she could speak. Her father had been a man of intermittent presence, deeply loving in the moments when he was emotionally available, but those moments were unpredictable and could not be reliably summoned. There was no pattern to his availability that Isabel, as a child, could decode. And so she had developed what attachment researchers, following John Bowlby's foundational work, would describe as an anxious attachment style, a relational orientation organized around the question of whether the attachment figure will be there, characterized by hypervigilance to signs of withdrawal, and by the particular exhausting hope that if she was attentive enough, responsive enough, loving enough, she could influence the unpredictable into something more reliable. This is the wound that had been running Isabel's attractions for 30 years, not consciously, not as a decision or a preference, as an unconscious gravitational pull toward men who activated the familiar emotional landscape of her childhood attachment, men who were intermittently available, who offered moments of genuine connection that were not reliably sustained, who created in her the same quality of reaching and hoping and monitoring that she had first developed in relation to her father, not because she wanted to suffer, but because the familiar, however painful, registers in the nervous system as known. And known, in the deep grammar of the unconscious, is indistinguishable from safe. Jung wrote that we encounter ourselves in disguise again and again across the journey of life. This is what he meant. We do not keep attracting the same man by accident or by misfortune. We keep attracting the same man because the unconscious is not trying to find us someone new. It is trying to resolve something old. It is trying to recreate the original relational dynamic in which the wound was formed, in the hope, the deep, unconscious, entirely irrational hope, that this time the outcome will be different, that this time the unavailable person will become available, that this time the love will be enough to close the gap, that this time we will finally get what we needed and did not receive in the original relationship that shaped us. This is the compulsion to repeat that Freud first identified, and that Jung deepened and expanded into a framework for understanding not just individual neuroses, but the entire architecture of unconscious life. And in the context of romantic relationships, it is one of the most powerful and most invisible forces that operates in most people's lives. Invisible because it does not feel like repetition from the inside. It feels like chemistry. It feels like recognition. It feels like, and this is the phrase I hear most often in the clinical room when women are describing the moment they met the man who turned out to be another version of the same story. It feels like coming home, coming home. That phrase contains everything, because home is not always a safe place. Home is the first place. Home is the place that shaped us, for better and for worse, and that left in us the neural and emotional templates through which we experience every subsequent relationship. And when a new person activates those templates, when they reproduce the emotional landscape of home, even a home that was painful, the feeling of recognition that results is almost impossible to distinguish from attraction. The nervous system does not differentiate between familiar and good. It differentiates between familiar and unfamiliar. And familiar always wins until the work is done. Isabel sat with this for a long time the first time I offered it to her. Not with the immediate recognition that sometimes comes when a person hears something they have always known but never had language for. With resistance. With the specific, important resistance of a person who is being asked to look at something that is going to require a significant revision of the story she has been telling about her life. Because the story she had been telling, the story in which she had made two genuine efforts to build a good marriage with two genuinely different men and had been let down by both of them, through their individual failures of availability, was a story in which she was not responsible for the pattern. And the story I was offering her, the story in which her own unconscious had been the primary architect of both of those selections, drawing her toward precisely the kind of man who would reproduce the emotional landscape she had been trying to escape since childhood, was a story that asked much more of her. I want to pause here and say something directly about this moment, the moment when the pattern is named and the question of responsibility arises, because it is one of the most delicate and most important moments in this kind of clinical work. Naming the unconscious pattern is not the same as blaming the person for their own suffering. Isabel did not choose her father's intermittent availability. She did not choose to develop an anxious attachment in response to it. She did not choose to carry that attachment template into her adult relationships. None of that was chosen. All of it was adaptation. The extraordinarily intelligent, entirely understandable adaptation of a child doing the best she could in the environment she was given. The wound is not her fault, and at the same time, the wound is hers. It lives in her. It has been shaping her choices. And the only person who has access to it, and therefore the only person who can do anything about it, is her. This is the distinction that changes everything, not fault, responsibility, not the responsibility of blame, but the responsibility of agency. The recognition that the pattern is not something that is happening to you. It is something that is happening in you. And what happens in you is the only territory over which you have any real influence. There is a layer beneath this that almost no one identifies, even in the most honest therapeutic work, until they are ready to see it. And it is the layer that transforms the entire experience of the pattern from something shameful or self-defeating into something that is, in its own way, a form of loyalty. Because the unconscious compulsion to repeat is not simply a malfunction, it is, at its deepest level, an attempt at repair. The psyche is not simply recreating pain for its own sake. It is recreating the original situation in the hope that this time, with the understanding and the resources of an adult rather than the helplessness of a child, the resolution will finally come. The problem is that the hope is misplaced. The resolution cannot come from the outside. The unavailable partner cannot become available enough to heal the wound that was created before they existed. The intermittently present husband cannot provide the reliable presence that the child needed and did not receive, because the wound is not located in the relationship. It was never located in the relationship. It was located in the original experience that shaped the template through which all subsequent relationships are filtered. And healing it requires going back to that original experience, not to relive it, not to assign blame, but to bring it into the light of conscious awareness and to grieve genuinely and specifically what was lost there. This is what Jung meant by shadow work, not the dramatic confrontation with the worst parts of oneself that popular culture tends to imagine when it uses that phrase. The quiet, patient, courageous work of sitting with the parts of your experience that were too painful to acknowledge at the time they happened, of letting yourself know what you know, of grieving what was not given, of releasing the unconscious loyalty to a dynamic that was painful then and is painful now, but that carries within it the hope, the child's hope, the deepest hope, that love will eventually be enough to make the unavailable available. That hope is not a weakness. It is the most human thing there is. And releasing it, not because love is not enough, but because the resolution you are seeking cannot be found in the place you have been looking for it. is one of the most profound acts of self-compassion that a person can perform. If you have been watching this and recognizing your own pattern, if the description of Isabel's marriages, or the description of the anxious attachment template, or the description of the unconscious compulsion to recreate the familiar emotional landscape of home has landed in a way that feels uncomfortably precise, I want you to know that what you are feeling right now is not the beginning of despair. It is the beginning of something else entirely. It is the beginning of the conscious awareness that is the only genuine alternative to fate. I have structured a guide for exactly this moment, for the person who has recognized the pattern and needs a clear, structured path from recognition to actual change. The ebook contains a detailed framework for identifying your own attachment template, where it was formed, how it expresses itself in your current or past relationships, and what the specific work of healing it actually involves. It is not a quick fix. There is no quick fix for something this deep, but it is a map. And a map, when you have been walking in circles without one, is worth more than almost anything else. The link is in the description. I will come back to it. But right now there is something even more important I need to show you. Because we have identified the pattern and we have named its origins, but we have not yet looked at what it actually takes to break it. And the breaking of it is not what most people expect. Breaking a pattern that has been operating in the unconscious for decades is not primarily a matter of making better choices. This is the misunderstanding that keeps most people trapped in the very cycles they are trying to escape. They believe that if they could just choose differently, if they could just identify the red flags earlier, resist the chemistry that has always led them astray, apply the intellectual understanding of what they now know about their patterns to the practical business of selecting a partner, the repetition would stop. And so they try harder. They make lists of what they will not accept. They set rules for themselves about how long they will wait before becoming emotionally invested. They develop sophisticated frameworks for evaluating potential partners against the criteria they have identified as important, and then they meet someone. And the chemistry is there, and the chemistry does not consult the list. This is because the pattern is not located in the choosing. It is located in the wanting, in what registers as desirable before the rational mind has had a chance to evaluate anything. In the specific quality of pull that certain people produce before a single word has been spoken, before a single behavior has been demonstrated, before there is any information at all beyond the felt sense, immediate, powerful, and entirely pre-rational, that this person is interesting, that this person is familiar, that this person feels in the particular way that the unconscious recognizes its own reflections, like home. You cannot choose your way out of an unconscious pattern. You can only become conscious enough of it that the unconscious pull begins to lose its absolute authority, that the familiar feeling of chemistry begins to be accompanied, over time, by a question rather than an immediate surrender, that the recognition of what is happening, this is the pattern activating, this is the wound seeking its resolution in the wrong place, creates enough of a pause to allow genuine choice to enter where compulsion used to operate alone. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not the elimination of the unconscious, that is neither possible nor desirable, but the gradual, sustained, genuinely demanding process of bringing more and more of the unconscious into conscious awareness so that its influence on your life moves from invisible to visible, from fate to choice. It is not a destination. It is a direction, a way of orienting toward your own inner life with increasing honesty and increasing courage over the course of a lifetime. Isabel arrived at this understanding not through a single insight, but through a process that took months, and that was, in its early stages, considerably more painful than the clarity she eventually reached. Because the first thing that happens when you begin to look honestly at an unconscious pattern is not relief, it is grief. The specific grief of understanding, for the first time with real precision, what you were actually trying to find in the relationships that hurt you, what you were hoping for, what the child in you was still reaching for through the adult choices that looked from the outside like simply bad luck or poor judgment. For Isabel, that grief arrived in a session about 6 weeks into our work together, in the middle of what had seemed like an ordinary conversation about her relationship with her father. She had been describing a specific memory, a Sunday afternoon when she was perhaps 7 years old, when her father had come home in one of his available moods, had sat with her on the porch, had listened to her with the full, warm, undivided attention that she knew from experience would not be there tomorrow and might not be there for weeks. And she had described the quality of that afternoon, the quality of hope it produced, the specific quality of love she had felt, the specific quality of trying to be exactly what was needed to make the afternoon last as long as possible. And then she had stopped. She sat in silence for a long moment. And then she said, very quietly, "I have been trying to recreate that afternoon my entire adult life. Every relationship I have been in, I have been trying to make someone give me that feeling reliably. And they cannot, and he could not, and I am not sure anyone can. This is the grief. Not the grief of the failed marriages, though that grief was real and needed to be honored. The grief beneath it, the grief of the original deprivation, of the child who needed reliable presence and received intermittent availability and adapted herself brilliantly to that reality and has been carrying the consequences of that adaptation ever since. The grief that, when it is finally felt rather than defended against, changes something fundamental. Not because grief is pleasant or because suffering produces transformation automatically, but because the grief, when it is genuinely felt, discharges the emotional energy that has been keeping the pattern in place. The longing that has been driving the compulsion to repeat is located in the unfelt grief. And when the grief is felt, the longing changes its character. It does not disappear, but it stops being a compulsion. It becomes something more like an ache that can be held rather than a hunger that must be fed. I want to talk now about what comes after the grief, because this is the part that is most consistently misrepresented in popular discussions of psychological patterns and how they change. The part after the grief is not the arrival of wholeness. It is not the sudden freedom from the pattern, the clean slate, the new beginning unshadowed by the old story. What comes after the grief is something more modest and more durable than any of those things. What comes is the capacity to notice. The capacity to notice is not glamorous. It does not feel like transformation in the moment it is exercised. It feels like a small pause, a brief interruption in the automatic processing that used to carry you from attraction to investment to the familiar dynamic before you had time to examine what was happening. It feels like the moment when you are in conversation with someone new and something in you registers the familiar pull. And instead of simply following it, you notice it. You name it internally. You recognize the quality of the chemistry and you allow yourself the question, what is this activating in me? Is this genuinely about this person, or is this the pattern recognizing a reflection of itself? That question is the practice, not the answer. The answer will not always be clear, and that is fine. The question itself is the work. The question introduces consciousness into a territory that was previously operating entirely on automatic. And consciousness, even in small doses, changes everything. Not immediately, not completely, but genuinely and cumulatively in the way that all real change accumulates through repetition, through the patient practice of choosing awareness over automatic pilot, one moment at a time. For Isabel, the practice of noticing began to change the texture of her experience in a way that surprised her. Not because she stopped feeling the pull toward familiar dynamics. She continued to feel it, and she was honest with herself about feeling it. But because the pull no longer felt like the whole story. It felt like one piece of information among several. She began to be curious about it rather than simply obedient to it. She began to ask what it was telling her about herself rather than simply following where it led. And in that space of curiosity, in the gap between the pull and the response to it that consciousness had opened, something new became possible. Not immediately, not in the form of a dramatically different relationship with a dramatically different kind of man, but in the form of a quality of presence in her own experience that she had not had before, a quality of being with herself in her own attractions and responses and longings that was grounded rather than reactive, that could hold the complexity of what she felt without immediately acting it out. Jung called this the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold apparently irreconcilable opposites, in tension long enough for something new to emerge from between them. In the context of relational patterns, the irreconcilable opposites are the longing for the familiar and the knowledge that the familiar has been causing harm, the compulsion to repeat and the desire to choose differently, the pull toward the man who feels like home, and the understanding that home was a place where something important was missing. The transcendent function does not resolve this tension by choosing one side or the other. It holds both until a third possibility, something that was not previously visible, becomes available. For Isabel, that third possibility arrived not as a new relationship, but as a new relationship with herself, a way of being in her own company that was not organized around the question of whether she was being seen and chosen and held by someone else. A capacity for solitude that was not loneliness but genuinely inhabitable. A self that could be present in its own experience without the constant background noise of monitoring for signs of availability or withdrawal in the people around her. This is what the shadow work produces at its most fundamental level. Not a better partner, not a healed relationship. A self that is present enough, grounded enough, known to itself thoroughly enough, that it can enter a relationship from a different position, not from the position of a child seeking the reliable presence that was not given in the original home, but from the position of an adult who has done enough of their own work that what they bring to a relationship is not primarily a wound seeking its resolution through another person, but a self-seeking, genuine contact with another self. The difference between those two positions is the difference between the relationships that repeat the pattern and the relationships that do not. And it is not a difference that can be manufactured through better partner selection or more rigorous boundary setting or any of the external strategies that relationship advice tends to focus on. It is a difference that can only be created from the inside, through the work, through the grief, through the patient, courageous, sometimes exhausting practice of becoming conscious of what has been unconscious. I want to speak directly now to the person who is watching this and thinking, I understand what you are describing, I recognize the pattern, I can even identify where it came from, and I have been trying to do this work for a long time, and it is not changing as quickly as I need it to. I want to say something important to that person. The work of individuation, of bringing the unconscious into consciousness, of integrating the shadow, of developing the capacity to choose rather than simply to repeat, is the work of a lifetime, not because you are particularly damaged or particularly unconscious or particularly resistant to change, but because the unconscious is vast and the patterns are old and the nervous system does not update quickly. And the most honest thing I can tell you is that this work does not have a finish line. What it has are thresholds, moments when something shifts permanently, when a particular pattern loses its automatic authority and becomes something you can see and name and choose in relation to, rather than simply be governed by. Those thresholds are real. They are reached. They are worth everything they cost to reach. But they are reached through practice, not through understanding alone. And this is where the structure matters, where having a clear, sequential, specific framework for doing the work, rather than simply understanding the work conceptually, makes a real difference in whether the insight translates into actual change in actual relationships. The ebook contains exactly this. Beyond the framework for identifying your attachment template and its origins, it contains what I call the shadow mapping exercise, a structured process for identifying the specific qualities that you are most powerfully attracted to in partners, and tracing each of those qualities back to its origin in your own psychological history. Not to eliminate the attraction, that is neither possible nor the goal, but to make it conscious, to be able to hold it with awareness rather than being held by it. It contains a guided grief process for the original wound, the specific sequential practice of feeling what has not yet been fully felt, and releasing the emotional energy that has been keeping the pattern in place. And it contains a framework for developing what I call conscious chemistry, the capacity to distinguish between the pull of the unconscious pattern and the pull of genuine compatibility, which feel quite different once you have developed enough internal awareness to tell them apart. The link is in the description. If you are ready to move from understanding the pattern to actually interrupting it, if you want a structured path through the work rather than the conceptual understanding of it without a clear way forward, this is the next step. As we come to the end of this video, I want to return to Jung, because there is a quality to his understanding of the human psyche that I find more useful and more honest than almost anything else in the psychological literature, and it is this. He never promised that the work would be easy or that consciousness would come without cost. He said, and I think this is one of the most important things ever said about the process of becoming who you are, that there is no coming to consciousness without pain, that the greater the resistance to looking at the shadow, the greater the suffering it produces when it is not looked at, and that the work of individuation, for all its difficulty, is the only genuine alternative to the unconscious repetition of patterns that were never chosen. Isabel is not in a relationship right now. She spent 2 years after our work together specifically not in a relationship, not as a rule she imposed on herself, but as a natural expression of having become genuinely interested in her own company for the first time. in her own inner life, in the specific, particular, irreducibly individual self that had been somewhat lost in the years of reaching for reliable presence in the people around her. She described this period to me not as loneliness, but as something she had no better word for than becoming. Becoming herself in a way that felt both entirely new and entirely like something that had always been there, waiting to be uncovered. She is not certain what her next relationship will look like. She is not certain what she will be attracted to when the chemistry arises again. But she told me something in one of our last sessions that I want to share with you, because it captures something about the outcome of this work that I have not heard described better anywhere. She said, "I'm not afraid of the pattern anymore. I can feel it when it activates. I can feel the pull, the recognition, the familiar quality of what used to feel like home. But it feels different now. It feels like information rather than instruction. It tells me something about myself rather than telling me what to do. Information rather than instruction. That is the shift. That is what consciousness does to unconscious patterns. It does not eliminate them. It changes their status. It moves them from the category of fate into the category of data. And data can be examined, questioned, held in context, integrated rather than enacted. Data gives you a choice, and choice, genuine, conscious, informed choice, is the only freedom that actually exists in the territory of who we love and how we love them. Your pattern is not your destiny, it is your history. And history, when it is understood rather than simply repeated, becomes the ground from which something genuinely new can grow. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because this series continues and every video takes you deeper into the work of becoming conscious, of knowing yourself well enough that your choices in love are genuinely yours rather than the unconscious enactment of a wound that was formed before you had any choice at all. The ebook is in the description. The link is there for when you are ready to move from insight to action, from understanding to the structured practice that creates real change. Carl Jung said that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are, not who the wound made you, not who the pattern trained you to be, not who the unconscious compulsion has been choosing for you across the years of your life. Who you truly are, beneath the adaptation, beneath the repetition, beneath the long, patient work of the shadow seeking its own integration. That self is not far away. It has been here all along, waiting for the light of conscious awareness to finally reach it. Welcome to the shadow of marriage, and welcome to the work of becoming free.